When I listened to John this last session, I had a multiple conscious experience. One of the moments as I was listening to him was like I got up in the morning and I went downstairs and someone had rearranged all the furniture. It's like, I think I recognize some of these pieces, but they sure aren't in the places where I remember them being. It's like rearranging the furniture. Another moment, as I was listening to him, is like, I'm no longer on Earth. I think I've been taken to Mars. And there's a whole new way of thinking, being, and putting things together. At another time, I felt like I was drinking out of a fire hydrant. Where one incredibly fascinating, different way of working at this came out, and it was almost like too much. And so I was thankful that this is available online, so I can go pick and choose, and I started archiving. But there were moments in the process where even my dull mind started running with the possibilities of adding to this repertoire of new resources and new possibilities. And so I'd invite you to take about 3 or 4 minutes as we get started and make the shift into the work we're going to be doing, to speak to one other person about a takeaway for you or a bit of your experience as you listen to John. What was going on in the ecology, in the economy of your experience as you listen to this possibility, this array of possibilities? Pick it up with another person or two. What happened? What are the takeaway? What's the takeaway for you? Come with me on 3 streams. One of those streams started long before we gathered yesterday and now today. It was a stream that included the gathering around the idea that the diocese was setting forth. It included even as focused work as doing an assessment of the ministry culture in your particular setting. You brought that all along. A second stream, John's been working in terms of what are the possibilities that might be available in terms of a particular project with a target audience that you might in fact now be choosing to work as a ministry experiment in your place. And so yesterday and now this morning, more of the grist for that mill as it turns and develops that project. Third stream, I'm really very interested in what's going on the ground, the isness of your congregation, the people in it, the community around it, and that out there with which you're going to be working as you also pick up with those inside the genius of your particular faith community. And so what we're going to do now, the rest of this morning and this afternoon, is to get ready to launch. And the readiness to launch will have as its first stage, as you leave here, an inquiry that accompanies, that picks up the curiosity that is already exercised in your area in terms of your asking what in fact is actually taking place here, what's going on. We want to come up alongside of that, refine that, so that as we come back together in August and you put together the actual project that you're going to be working with, as these streams have flown together, the stream of imagination, the stream of the possibilities that in fact might be possible in terms of ministry, and the stream of what's actually going on in your place, that project can be deeply ensconced in the very life of the congregation, the parish, and the community of which you are a part as a leader. So we're getting ready to launch. What I want to do is I want to take you into the specifics of that process and accompany you as you go about putting your particular project together. I'm going to do 3 things with you, 1.5 of those this morning, and then the 2.5 this afternoon. And here are the 3. As an investigator, a theological anthropologist, I'm always interested as I get into the world itself in this question: where is God showing up? God sightings. And how would I know that it's not just indigestion? Might I, in fact, as I go about being attentive to God's presence and activity in the world, do that not just as an individual, but join others in a critical conversation about what I saw, and to be able to be in dialogue with them and check out whether it's indigestion or, in fact, it is, in fact, a nudge, or it is, in fact, a surprise. It is, in fact, a new calling, a new direction in which a prophet or a priest, or perhaps simply the silent murmuring of creation, nudges me to follow God in a new and productive way. And so here's what I'd like to have you do as we get started this morning. I'd like to have you turn to one other person and speak to them about a past and a current God sighting. So if I were to sit with someone and do that this morning, I would talk about things like this. When I was 7 years old, I had a ruptured appendix. It was in the middle of the winter in North Dakota. The roads were all blocked. Lawrence Knoche had a Piper Cub on skis. It's a little small airplane. He landed it near our farm. My dad carried me out through the snow, falling up to his armpits, put me and my mother in this little plane with Lawrence Knoche. We flew to the closest hospital. Half hour later, I was on the operating table, and I was shot, my buttocks and my shoulders, with penicillin in big syringes. It was just after the Second World War, and had been proven and used in the Second World War, saved my life. I wanted to die during that period of time. In the middle of the night, sitting next to my bed was this huge figure, peeling oranges. She was a refugee from Czechoslovakia after the war, a nurse who had the night shift and who coaxed my spirit into living in the middle of the night. I looked at that figure sitting next to me, smothering. She was, in fact, bringing oranges into the hospital when she wasn't supposed to, peeling them and giving them to me. An angel, a God sighting, I think a God sighting out of the past. If I were to talk about a God sighting for me currently, I turned the television on last night, and there was our president singing Amazing Grace. And that's my song. And I discovered a ton of other people's songs. And I had, sitting in my motel room last night, this deep sense of gratitude and celebration that God is alive and present. Even, and one of the speakers before our president spoke about how this act was intended to turn us into class warfare. And here, in fact, this church, out of an old idea, an incredibly powerful idea that our Lord died for, forgiveness, turns around the news cycle. God is not dead. God is alive and present. So I encourage you to turn to another person and talk about a past God sighting and a present God sighting. Something that you would say, interpret out of your past and out of your present, that God is showing up around you in your life. Please, pick it up. You don't have long. I'll try to bring you back. Take up your pink or rose sheets. You're going to need these, and pick up a pencil, a pen, or something with which to write. We're going to get down to business now in terms of putting together our plan of action as we get prepared to lunch. So, your pink sheet, get it out, and turn to page 3. Turn to page 3. For those of you who are new, I encourage you sometime during the lunch perhaps or in the next few days to review pages 1 and 2. For those of you who are new, it'll give you an oversight, a kind of, if you will, step-by-step, quick USA Today bullet point sense of what's going on. We're now going to, in the time we have remaining this morning and some of the time this afternoon, get at the particulars of the action plan for one of the streams of our development, and that is to do assessment and research, getting at what's the case in our congregation and in its surrounding community, and perhaps also in some of those networks with whom our members from some distance driving to our campus might come. So I'll talk about my parish as an example. Christ the King has as its immediate surrounding environment a particular setting in New Brighton, Minnesota. But we have many members who drive 7-8 miles from Brooklyn Center, and they rub shoulders and live a domestic and a civic life in a different place. And they bring with them some of the sensibilities and possibilities of that particular setting where they, in fact, live. What we're going to do in this exercise is we're going to focus primarily on that community where the campus is located. But we're also going to pay some attention to who are those people with whom members who come from 7, maybe even some 15, 20, 25 miles away are also rubbing shoulders and living their lives. And I think as I talk that way and imagine about the incredible human interaction of a member of an Episcopal parish in New Jersey as a part of this chunk of America from Boston to Washington, D.C. On the trains, day to day, as you interact, the languages, the ethnic groups, it's incredible as one thinks about workplace, play places, and so forth. So we're going to be focusing on a particular territory, but we're also going to keep in mind that people are, in fact, interacting with folks in their primary, in their civic, and in their work lives. Now, with that in mind, what we're going to do this morning is we're going to get ready to interact with the processes that will give us the demographics of the location. We're going to interact with the processes that will identify who the church leaders are in your setting with whom you want to conduct interviews. And we're going to identify, in terms of your target audience, who might be the focus groups, 5 or 6, that you might gather together. Footnote. As we do that, I'm aware that you're already wondering, thinking, and many of you perhaps have even systemically been about investigating what's the case about your setting. Some of you may have been doing it informally, just checking in with people, asking people questions, and so forth. Others of you may have been doing a long-range planning process, or you're in a transition process between rectors. You may have done some of this work already. So I encourage you not to replicate, but to build on what you already have in place. So the first question I would encourage you to ask in regard to data, demographics, in regard to your setting, is what documentation do you have that already reflects work that's been done? So think about with whom you would talk, both in terms of the congregation and with whom you would speak in terms of the area to pick up on and stand on the shoulders of study that's already been done. Now, as we think about these tasks, demographics, interviews, focus groups, and as we think of gathering that data and making sense of it, there will be two roles that will be critical. And in just a minute, as I put you to work, I'm going to ask you to start thinking in terms of your team, who might be assigned those two roles. The first is the role of convener. Convener. One might even push that role a bit and ask this person to also have the big picture in mind, to be an overseer, if you will, a person who goes to bed at night worrying about the hole. Not the hole in the ground, but the entirety. Someone who thinks about the entirety. I have in my family a family member who does this, who looks at the big picture and looks at all the pieces and regularly asks questions about what hasn't been taken care of or what's left behind. I happen to be married to her. And she is an incredible gift to our family and to my life. At times, she's just an irritant. Did you shut the door? Or whatever. But a convener, someone who gathers, and someone who has a penchant, a gift, if you will, for thinking about the whole. Are you with me? Okay? A convener, a person who is somewhat of an overseer. The second person, equally as important, is a recorder. Or perhaps we might call this person a chronicler. But we might even nudge this task into being a reporter. I've discovered that transparency with people in a congregation is in fact a way of building trust, but it also is an incredible way of educating people and bringing people into the sphere of influence of a particular project. Do you know this is taking place? Do you know we're doing thus and so? What do you think about our picking up this task? And I discovered there are a group of people who are really very ready to be Sunday morning quarterbacks. And if I'm not defensive, I can listen to what they say and learn from them as this process unfolds. So the second role is a person who's good at journaling, perhaps, keeping a log, chronicling, keeping a list of things, so that if you will, there's a communication trail as to what's happened, what is happening, and so forth. Are you with me? So in just a minute, I'm going to ask you to go to work as a team to start thinking about putting in place some of these elements. Your first task will be to think about who might these two people be on behalf of your task force. Good? Okay? All right, with that then, let's step into the more of the demographics. On page 3, you'll notice at the top of the page, part 1, church demographics. Just so you're clear, what's meant there is your congregation, your parish, not all the parishes of the diocese, but your particular congregation, okay? Ethnic diversity of church members, again, your church. Age diversity of church members, again, your church. But now as you've done that work, and you can take up the imagination of how you go about getting that information. There are a variety of ways of doing that. Very often in the annual reporting process of the diocese, you've got those statistics. You may want to even get behind some of those. I discovered when I was a pastor that when we put those figures together, they were sometimes jiggered. And so one of the questions you might want to ask is this the way it actually is, or is this the way it was once? Get as accurate a picture as you can. Now, then beyond that, I want to wonder with you. Get your pencils ready. You can write anywhere in the margins. I want to wonder about getting this kind of data about the area around your congregation. Ages, an age profile of the community around you. So, for example, my congregation, Christ the King, if you put a profile of ages next to the profile of ages of New Brighton, whoa, are we out of whack. Those two profiles, just age profiles, speak to us dramatically in regard to we need to pay some attention to the fact that New Brighton is one of the places where a goodly number of young adults are moving into the city and starting jobs. And we have hardly any truck with them. Neither in terms of members, many of them left us, nor in terms of interaction. So, an age profile. Secondly, race and ethnicity. Not necessarily the same, but really two critical questions to ask. What's the race, ethnic sensibilities? What's the makeup around? Gender and orientation. As much information we have in New Brighton, a gay and lesbian community that most people don't know about, but some connections with some key lesbian persons in our congregation brought us into conversation with this community who was looking for a safe place for spiritual inquiry. It was a huge opportunity and moment. Occupations. The kind of industries or business community, the kind of nonprofit community often become potential partners. Are there major festival and events that mark and become some of the big, if you will, moments, the episodal and kairotic moments in the life of the community? So gather, if you will, as you talk in just a bit, ask the question, what would be important for our target audience project? What would be important for us to know about the demographics of the community around us? So when you're finished with this piece, in maybe 5 to 6 pages, you could have a running, if you will, analysis of what's true and maybe some of the interesting points of intersection that might, in fact, feed carefully, thoughtfully into your target audience project. Are you with me? Okay? So when you leave here today, you've not only talked about a convener and a recorder, but you've also talked about here are the kinds of data, the kinds of information that we want to get regarding not only our congregation, but our community. All right, let's leave this one. We'll come back to it this afternoon a bit. Let's go now to page 4. And I'll give you just a couple of very simple instructions. In ethnographic work, there are a number of ways of gathering good information. One of them is to listen to people. So one does interviews, one does focus groups. One of them is to take a look at the literature. And so whatever studies have been done and been produced, whatever demographic information is available, and one picks up on that, statistical data. Another is to simply go to places where things happen. For example, I went to a school board meeting in our neighborhood. I walked into the school board meeting, and my gut read out what was going on. People's teeth were on edge. It was like when I walked in, I was walking on eggshells. Shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have talked to that person, or because I sat here, I was thought to be this. Sometimes you have to be there to get it. One might go to some of the key places in your neighborhood and just be there. One of the places today that's really, really very delicate is any place where law enforcement is being worked out. I went the other day to our police station and just talked to some people and asked if I could do a ride around. And they assigned me a time, and so I got into a cruiser and rode around. Wow, did I get a sense of where our policing process is that got beyond the newspapers, beyond the news, beyond the statistics, now is in the life of both the police and the neighborhoods and the community as they were interfacing. Are you with me? Okay. So I want you to talk at your table in regard to this one. Where might you go to get a hand on the pulse of your community? Where might you go that would enable you to put your finger on the pulse of the community? Where might you go? And who would go there? Who would go there? Who in your task force might go there? Thirdly, where and who, but how? Would you walk around? Would you do a drive around? By the time you leave here today, I would encourage you to have a list, a doable list of where, who, how you're going to do that, so that you can very quickly, when you leave here, get at this part of the work. So that as you sit together the 29th of August, if I should come to you and ask, so tell me about your place of ministry, the parish, the territory of your ministry. Are there potential partners there? What's the mood? You could, in fact, with some confidence, say, we're going to take this seriously as we work with this. One of the places I would encourage you to go would be to those places where older people gather, because so much of who we have to work with in our parishes are mature adults. I would also encourage you to go, as we said, to some of those new places where people gather to have food and spirituality, coffee houses, and to some of the places where youth and their parents gather and get some sense of what's going on. You pick up that story. That's as much as I want you to have done this morning. Where would you go? Who would do this? And so on. Third place, I want you to go to page 5. And in this one, we're going to be working with church leaders. And I want you to imagine 5 or 6 church leaders that will be germane to the accomplishment of your target audience. Now, if I were to ask that question, one of the ways I would get at that question would be, in what domain of life and ministry is this target audience project going to be working? Let's say it has to do with missional outreach, or let's say it has to do with intergenerational faith formation. I would ask, who are the persons that have been appointed responsibility or have on-the-ground responsibility for this particular aspect of the life of the parish? I want to know that. But secondly, I would ask, who participates? Who's involved in these processes? I'd want to get at some of that. Then I'd ask, for whom does this matter? I spent a whole lot of my life as a scholar and a teacher researching what is the case in the first third of life. And so many of the research projects I did brought me into contact with grandparents who were wringing their hands over the lack of faith of their grandchildren. And what was just amazing in that process were two things. First, how little they really knew of the spirituality of their grandkids. They were reading off of a lens that was theirs in terms of whether or not this person is actively religious. And so one of the tasks I regularly set grandparents to doing was spending significant time with a particular grandchild, whether electronically or physically, and finding ways to develop a common language to enter into their existential realities and to pick up on the varieties of spirituality and faith practices that were actually the case in the life of their grandkids. Found a whole new bonding develop. So a third group of people you might want to go to might be whose expectations are large for this particular target project you're working. Finally, I would encourage you as you think about this one to also think about not the elected, not the upfront, not the appointed, not the public person who leads in these areas, but the de facto power brokers. It's just the way human systems function. And I'd encourage you to think about who some of these people might be. All right, so what I want to do is I want to assign you now to go to work to do these tasks in the next 15, 20 minutes. First, who might be convener, recorder? Okay? Second of all, what are we going to do? What's going to be the focus of gathering the demographics? And thirdly, who are the 5 or 6 people that we're going to interview in regard to getting to know the ways in which our parish might be functioning around the particular target audience in which we're going to work? Is that clear enough? Have you been able to follow me? All right? Gather your group if you stay here or if you go elsewhere and go to work on this. All right? Get after it. As we were talking about particularly the task of getting at the demographics of the congregation and around the congregation, Father Harry came up and said, the Episcopal Church has in fact a service that gets at this. Harry, will you say just a bit about it, because you have in fact used it.
Okay, basically what it is if you go on the Episcopal Church website, you'll have to click under ministries and I think whatever else, get to demographics. It will give you a snapshot of your parish with your attendance levels, your membership, but also if you click on the area, there it is, there's the Episcopal Church website, okay. If you click, there you go, you put in your diocese, New Jersey, and then your parish, and then if you click on that, you can get a 3-mile radius of all the demographics around your parish.
1, 2, 3.
Harry, thank you. Thank you. For me, this. Let's just pause for a moment. Any questions about this that we might put to Harry in regard to this? Someone else held up a sheet. You've already accessed that information. That's great. Any comments? Oh, excuse me. Harry, say something about it. What do we have?
This is the slide. Well, the other one. That's the slide about just what the top line is your income. The blue is the actual number of people who you have as baptized members, and the red is your attendance. Okay.
As I visited the groups in a variety of ways, a couple of interesting inquiries emerged in regard to such data. For example, someone asked, if our project and its target audience is primarily within the life of the congregation, the parish. Is it important for us to take a look at all at what's going on around the parish in the surrounding community and where people in the parish, in fact, might live? And my response to that would go something like this. While it may not be as directly applicable as a project that is working on missional outreach, it's that environment that profoundly influences much of what goes on in the life of the parishioners, in the way the parish is perceived, and the possibilities. So to, in fact, bring that into dialogue with your project, even if your project is focused primarily with, let's say, an intergenerational group within the parish, can be helpful. Does that make any sense to you? Okay? Okay. All right, so let's see if there are any other comments or questions you have in regard to, first of all, the appointment of the convener and the appointment of the recorder. Are you good with that? Okay? Excellent. Excellent. Secondly, other materials surrounding the question of demographics. Have we comments, questions that would be helpful to air in regard to working with demographics? The suggestions that have been made, the resources that Harry and you made, sir, in terms of Percept, exceedingly helpful. I could feel in the room the sense of, whoa, this is sheer gift. Great. All right, we can come back, but let's move from there to the walk around and the observation of the community. Here are some questions that came up as I visited the groups. So, what should we be looking for? Was one set of questions. A second set of questions had to do with, depending on what our target audience is, and we don't know quite yet what our target audience is, are you making assumption here there's something missing between yesterday, where we either listed 3 or maybe said we haven't landed yet, to today you're talking about, well, you must know who your target audience is. Let me respond to that one in this way. As we've worked with you from the very announcement of this, we've gone from very broad and general sense of this project to greater and greater focus along the way. And part of the purpose of that has been, rather than top-down deciding for you what you're going to do, with whom you're going to do it, we've wanted to come up alongside of you and together with you discern what it is you're going to do and with whom you're going to do it. So what's occurred in these last couple of days is we provided some good information, we think, that you can use to think through, given who we are, our mission, given where we are and what's going on around us, given who our congregation is and what we've learned, what is it, if we put those together, we see us wanting to do by way of an experiment in terms of ministry in a new time. Some of you are clear about that. You've gotten farther along in that discernment process than others. That's just fine. Do you have to have all that ready before one starts looking into the area, church leaders, focus groups? No, not necessarily. In fact, it could be that your investigation of the area, your investigation of the church leadership, and your investigation of the focus group possibilities or some of the stakeholders around might in fact further refine your focus in terms of what you want your project to be. So keep whatever level of particularity you have in conversation with the information, and keep whatever information that you're discovering in confirmation or in conversation with your decision. And the notion is, by the time you come here on the 29th of August, all of this will have pushed to a place, or if it hasn't, we're going to push you to a place of deciding this, but not all this. coming down. That is, you've come to the airport, and now you have to land someplace. Do you see the dialogue? It's messy, it's somewhat confusing, but it's a way of, as much as possible, staying true to the Holy Spirit and true to your particularity in terms of your strengths, passions, and in terms of what you want to know from what's going on around. Thus, the relationship between target audience, project, and the research. Now, let's just for a moment stop and ask, what might you want to be viewing when you do your walk around, drive around, or visits? First of all, if you take a look at your pink sheet, we have listed some of the genre of areas you might want to look into. In the first paragraph on that pink sheet on page 4, you'll notice the following. During this period of time, we suggest a month, maybe everyone in the committee does some of this kind of work, or everyone in the task force, observing people at work, at school, at play, at stores, in coffee shops, restaurants, and so on. Here's the point. Can we learn from observing lifestyle? Can we learn from observing the way people spend their most precious commodity, time? John has regularly referred to the notion of waiting and what people do when they're waiting. I'll fly back to Los Angeles with Southwest, and I'll get in the cattle line as we line up to get on the airplane. And if it's anything like when I came from Los Angeles, if I look around, people will be doing what? They'll be using their personal device to do a whole variety of things. And so that one phenomena, what does waiting mean? And John has given us some clues. So first of all, to get at lifestyle as you take a look at people's way of spending time in these variety of times and places. Then 1 through 5, we've given you some specific places or questions you may want to ask. Use those as a way of priming the pump. Popular activities, where people gather, where people work, churches that may have excellent attendance at differing times, and where are people in your communities on Sunday morning? Beginning set of questions. But my guess is you have your own curiosity about your communities. If I were to do this in terms of my community, one of the really interesting phenomena for me is we have an area of manufactured housing. So when I go jogging in the morning, I jog through sometimes the manufactured housing and discover an interesting set of differing lifestyles. I would really like to talk with some of those people and find out how our congregation might come up alongside of some of my wonderment. It seems as though people come and go, that the audience or the people who live here are really quite transient. They come and go often. What does that all mean? My guess you'll have your own questions. So my encouragement is, as you do that work, then you use the Stanford School of Design as a lens to look at it. What have you heard people saying? What are they doing? Do you have any sense of what they're thinking? And do you have any notion of what they're feeling? One of the powerful motivators, if one's going to be working with people, is how to enter their world, what are the doorways, and how might those windows and doorways be impactful as one picks up with people. So those are some suggestions as places to start. In your meeting within the next couple of weeks, I would encourage you to come down in some very specific ways as to what you think you want to know and might be helpful. Okay? Use it as the best way you can for your particular situation. Can we move from there to looking at leadership? identifying the church leadership and doing the interviews with the church leadership. Here are some questions that came up, just two out of my talking with people this morning as you got started identifying 5 or 6 leaders. One, who do you mean by church leaders? Here is some of my thinking, and John, you listened, you were helpful in terms of clarification here. I would think that the rector, pastor, would be one person that it would be important, no matter what the ministry or what the particular project will focus on, that you would interview. Okay? To think about the rector as being one possibility. Second of all, the vestry has certain leadership. And if there is a person or two within the vestry who has particular responsibility or concern in the area that you're considering working on, I would think give some consideration to who that might be, a possible vestry leader. Let's say, to use John's example, it's in the area of family that you're working, to look around your congregation and to ask, who has anything to do with ministry practices with families? And as you sort that out, to see if there's anyone that comes up and identify that person as a person you might interview. Then I would have you think about, are there persons who are particularly engaged and involved in family ministry, who don't have leadership roles, but are heavily engaged, and who are in some ways de facto critical players in the process as one possible set or group of candidates for, in fact, interviewing. Do you get the drift of how this works? Okay? And part of the reason for being more general rather than specific is, again, we want to honor what it is that you're pursuing, and as you work with pursuing a particular area, it's important to, in fact, follow that in terms of who's leading that within the congregation. Now, let's say you're broad yet in terms of your target audience. What you may want to do then is you may want to choose, in addition to the rector, a variety of people who are working with a variety of ministries to help you with some of that thinking. So depending on where you are in that focus process in regard to target audience, that may govern how you who you see. Okay? That's the first question. The second question that came up was, so what do you do when you interview them? And if you take a look at page 5 of what we presented, let's again look at on 2 columns. On the one side, we've made some suggestions. Let's say you're again working with families. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can read those questions through the lens of working with families, let's say intergenerationally. Or let's say you're working with adult faith formation. You can read those questions through the lens of adult faith formation. As you work those questions that we've suggested, I would encourage you to have a blank column in which you keep asking, what are my questions? What would I like to know? Whatever you do, once you have put together that list of questions, I think it's important that it probably be no more than 5 to 7 in terms of a given interview, and that those same questions be used in each of the interviews. So once you've got them, you create a sheet that has them on, perhaps even with quite a lot of white space, and those 5 to 7 questions become the common questions that are used with the rector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And then as you do the interview, trust your sensibility in terms of follow-up questions. Regularly when I'm doing these interviews, A person will, let's say, describe how our church helps our target audiences or this particular ministry with families. And as they say what they say, they may go blah, 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 and then they go blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, whoa, what's that intensity about? And I'll wonder about their strong feeling about that particular matter. And suddenly we've gone from general talking about this subject to being on message in a particular way. Or I'll hear them use a word over and over and over again. And I'll then follow up on that word. So, common set of questions that you've designed, used in all of the interviews, with the notion that as you ask them, you're going to be attentive, actively listening, and following up on some of what you heard. In just a minute, as we go to work in a group, we're going to ask that insofar as you're able, given the focus group, given the target audience, for you to identify the 5 to 7 people that you might interview and to get started thinking about the questions, okay? Who might you interview and what about the questions? But before you go there, let's go to the focus groups, okay? And here I'm going to work off what John just said in terms of focus groups. You can read the data that's here, the information that's here in terms of numbers in the focus groups, in terms of questions. But 2 points I want to make in terms of focus groups. I would think you will want to imagine who are stakeholders, that is, who are persons for whom this area of concern that we have really matters. For whom does this really matter? And there may be different ideas in the task force, but to ask the question, for whom does this matter? Who has a stake in this? And as John said, let's say it's families. Some of these people who have an incredible stake in what we're going to be doing are within the congregation in varying ways. Others of them will not be. So it could very well be that you want to put together a cross-sectional focus group, or more than one focus group, that includes people of differing engagements within the congregation, as well as some people outside the congregation. And one of the ways that I use to get people outside the congregation respectfully invited into these conversations is to ask members of the congregation to ask someone they know to join them in this conversation. And it's also a way of, if in your parish you have persons who come from 20 miles away or 6 miles away or whatever, to bring some people or a person or two from their environments into the conversation. So let's say I put together a focus group on intergenerational faith formation or intergenerational learning. I would want to, in that focus group of 8 to 12 people, I'd want to think generationally, okay? Maybe 2 generations, 3 generations. I would want to think engagement within the congregation and outside the congregation. I would want to think gender. I would want to think representation of ethnicity. And if at all possible, I'd want to put together more than one and perhaps as many as 4 or 5. So in just a bit, and when we go to work on this, I invite you to think about at least 2 focus groups that you would form that would help you develop a deeper understanding of your target audience and the subject matter that you want to be working on. 2 focus groups, who would be in them, how would you go about scheduling them, and so forth. And that the questions here again become, in fact, for you, the beginning priming of the pump of what questions you might want to be asking, and you have your own column, and you create a common set of questions that will be worked in both the focus groups. All right, I want to put you to work in terms of moving this forward. And here are the questions I want you to work with. These questions. First, who are the leaders that you need? Recorder, convener. Recorder, convener. You've got that set. Secondly, who are the persons you're going to interview? As far as you can move that, who are the persons you're going to interview? How far along can you move that? Thirdly, put together in your thinking as well as you can 2 focus groups. Who should be in them? And then once you've done that, put together a timeline. When are you going to do this? When do you have to have what done to do this? And use as the end of that timeline being here the 29th of August. Okay? Is that clear? Convener, recorder. Who are you going to interview? 2 focus groups. And a timeline for this work that gets you here with that data by the 29th of August.